To start, I need to explain this sermon will discuss adult topics. So if you have smaller kids in the room, now would be your chance to send them over to the kids wing. I think teenagers will be okay. I'm not going to be raunchy or anything, but we are talking about adult stuff, right? This is real life, okay? I should also tell you, bye-bye. All right, bye-bye now. I should also tell you that I don't get embarrassed ever at all. So when you're blushing, I'll pretend to blush along with you, but I will not be embarrassed. I don't think Christians need to be embarrassed. That's part of the problem, is that to talk about sexuality and intimacy should be an everyday part of our life and our faith experience. If there's anything in your life that feels taboo, you ever play the game Taboo, where you're not allowed to say the words on the card and they get beeped? I feel like sex is one of the things that's obviously part of our life as Christians, but it's taboo. You're not supposed to talk about that. That's stupid, so we're going to talk about it. All right, to do that, I want to start with a perspective shift. So in the last 100 years or less, I would argue that the conversation around sex has really been transformed, maybe even just in the last 40 or 50 years in particular. But I think that conversation has been transformed in not just around sexuality, but in culture. I think our culture has shifted more in the last few generations than any other time in human history that I would know of. Let me give you some explanation of what I mean. Just since the 1960s, the internet, email, smartphones, artificial intelligence, transportation, a post-Christian culture in the Western world, the mapping of the human genome, civil rights. I mean, the list could go on and on, right? They're all the things that have happened or changed since the 50s and 60s, just in the Western world. It's an amazing thought how much has changed. It would be no surprise then that the conversation about sex has also changed, or sexuality or intimacy. It's required that we speak differently about it because the conversation is different. We can't say what we used to say. One of the huge shifts is that sex is now disconnected from childbearing for the first time in human history. Some of you don't realize this. Many of us weren't born in the 60s and 70s, but for those of you who were, you may not remember that that's when oral contraceptives became legal, in the 1960s. That's in your lifetime. In this room, there are people who were very much alive and healthy and well. That's very recent history is what I'm trying to say. We're not talking about a long, long time ago. We're talking about our own lifetimes. Oral contraceptives became a thing. And it wasn't until 1972 that the Supreme Court made it legal for non-married people to get a prescription for oral contraceptives. Some of you probably didn't know that. So before 1972, only married people could use birth control. And before the 1960s, there was no oral contraceptive. There was no pill that you could take. So think about that. Just since the 60s and 70s, how much that would have changed the game when we're talking about sexuality. Because now, sexuality is detached from childbearing. You can just take pills so that you don't have to worry about getting pregnant. At least, statistically, your odds are a lot better. Or worse, or however you want to phrase that. Okay, so 5 points, because I didn't want to just ramble, and I definitely don't want to go off my notes for this sermon. God help us all. Five points that I think, and these aren't the sermon points, these are the introductory points. 5 points for my introduction about why I think the conversation has shifted, or how I think the conversation has shifted. The first point, today, the primary purpose of sex is for pleasure for most people, not for childbearing, not procreation, but pleasure. That's a huge shift. For millennia, for thousands of years, the main function of sex was to make children. Whether there was pleasure involved or not was an afterthought for many people in many cultures. Of course, people enjoyed sexual experiences, but it was primarily for children, to have children, and there was always the risk that you would have a child. And in recent history, very recent history, that risk has almost entirely been removed from a lot of people's equation. Between birth control contraceptives and vasectomies and the tying of fallopian tubes and all the different things we can do now to prevent pregnancy, you can have sex disconnected from procreation. That's really a big shift that we don't often think about in our own lifetimes, just in our generation. The second point, sex is now encouraged for all people, not just married couples, which again is a big shift, and not just in the American West with Christianity. That was a cultural norm in pretty much every culture all over the world for all of human history. that you would partner with one other person and have a family. That was the traditional view in almost every culture and every religious group. This isn't just an American Christian thing. But today, sexuality and sex in general, intimacy of a physical nature, it's encouraged for everyone to enjoy and experience, regardless of your relationship status or your home life. Thirdly, and these all kind of overlap, the third point is that sex is now disconnected from male-female relationships. And we're not trying to get into the hot button issues of homosexuality and all that. I'm happy to talk to you privately about that. But what I am saying is whether you like it or not, whether you support it or not, the world's idea of sexuality has shifted in today's culture so that sex is no longer associated with just a male-female relationship. That's no longer people's instinct or assumption. That's a big shift. Again, whether you support that or not isn't my concern right now. My concern is what has changed so that we can honestly talk about it as Christians. That has changed, okay? Number 4, sex has also been disconnected from love, emotion, long-term commitment. Think about that. There's a new ethos of hookup culture. I mean, if I asked you right now, I bet there's a bunch of people in here who have Tinder on their phone. Some of you should have deleted it a long time ago, but you still have it. We got to get into that another time. So a lot of this stuff we have to talk about privately, don't we? But we can say a blanket statement, apps like Tinder now exist, and they didn't before. You literally swipe left or swipe right. You're just picking and choosing sort of willy-nilly who you're attracted to, who you're interested in. And that creates a culture, or rather it's born of a culture that's already been fostered that is hookup-based. It's about quick satisfaction, about lightning fast experiences and then moving on to the next thing. It's a disposable system, even in our relationships that are supposed to be intimate. That's a big shift. And that's really based on people in the culture delaying marriage and children, if they desire children, later and later and later so that they can further their education and their independent careers and travel and see the world and fulfill their desires before they have to settle down. Again, whether you like that or not, it's just the reality. That has shifted. The perspective has shifted. Lots of people, I think, still want marriage and kids, but it's the messy sacrifice that's involved. It's the commitment that's involved that makes people keep pushing it back eventually. Eventually, I'll settle down. Eventually, I'll have a family. But right now, I'm just trying to see what's out there. I'm trying to live my own life. That ethos, that way of thinking is pretty much brand new in human existence. Like no one has ever thought like that until the last 50 years. And then the fifth and final point is my most concerning point. Sex has been disconnected from humans, from people. Sex has been disconnected from actual people. There are elaborate sex robots that you could order on the internet today. Advanced toys. There are interactive digital media now that it's not just porn, it's interactive stuff that you can give commands and interact with. And there's anime and cartoon stuff and AI generated. Everybody just saw all this stuff about Taylor Swift, right? AI generated pornography, nude pictures that are of a person who wasn't even in the picture because it's been created by code in a computer that isn't even connected to a real human entity. I mean, someone wrote the computer code, but there's no person drawing these pictures. This is completely dehumanized. Think about how scary that is. I mean, that point alone could be a sermon, right? That sexuality has been disconnected from humans. It has become completely independent. You by yourself can experience supposed intimacy, but you know that's not possible, right? Because there is no intimacy unless there's another person involved. But we've done that. We've taken sex and tried to pull it away from intimacy altogether. We've dehumanized it. Did you know, statistically speaking, that the current Gen Z young adults, like people right now in their late teens and 20s, that they have less sexual encounters than any generation before them that we've recorded in that age bracket. So during college years and young adulthood, they are having less sex or having sex less often than the last few generations that we know of. And that's not because they have a really great ethical compass. I wish that's what it was, but statistics say it's based on two things. One of them you could probably guess, and that's pornography addiction, because they've dehumanized sex. They have access to other options that are a lot less complicated than a human relationship, but not as satisfying, of course. The second issue, and this one didn't surprise me, but I hadn't really thought about it. They don't know how to flirt. This is science. This is statistical, quantifiable evidence, okay? They don't know how to interact with other human beings. They can sext and send nude pictures, but they don't know how to actually flirt with another human being. They don't know how to be romantic. Have you ever been around people today in their late teens and 20s? They're awkward. And I'm only 31. I'm telling you, I'm not far removed and I can be a bit awkward. There's a lot of truth to that, isn't there? If you've worked with younger people, and you know at times the social dynamic is just off. And that plays into their romantic relationships. They often don't know how to continue to have deep, intimate conversations with another human to build romance, to have that kind of intimacy together, so they just don't. They just hook up or they don't hook up at all, and then you end up with statistics that are skewed toward not having sex. Whatever you think about that, I just think it's fascinating. It shows that the culture is shifting, that things are changing. Now, I will say, confusion and curiosity around sex or surrounding sex, that's not news for us. Humans have always been curious about sexuality. They've always cheated on spouses, slept around with other partners, hired prostitutes. I mean, even in the ancient world, we see people doing that. We see same-sex relationships. We see gender fluidity, transgenderism in ancient indigenous cultures. Some of you think that's just new American nonsense. This is just what people do when they explore sexuality. They always have. I'm not saying any of it's necessarily good. I'm just saying it's part of the human experience. We see orgies as common practice in ancient cultic literature. That's why Paul tells the church in the Bible, he says to the early churches, don't participate in the orgies, as if it was just common knowledge that they had orgies all the time at their temples. Why does no one talk about this? The new sexy world we live in is not new. People have always been sexual, and they've always questioned it. And sex has always been complicated. Anybody uncomfortable yet? Just wait, there's more. I think what is really unique about our present cultural moment, and I know that's a buzzword, the present cultural moment, but it's true. We are in a cultural moment, this moment in time that is unique. And I think it's that these expressions of sexuality, they function as a resistance movement today. Think about that. It's as if the embrace of your sexual freedom is also putting an end to oppressive systems. By you being sexually free, you are putting an end to misogyny and bigotry in the world. By exploring sexuality without any kind of resistance or parameters in place, you are in fact rising up against the patriarchal systems of old, the things that were so broken. And I agree, those systems were flawed and broken. But it's as if now sexual freedom ends oppression. We know that's not true, right? Turn on the news, watch Law & Order SVU, right? I know it's fake, but it's based on real life, isn't it? And this is not a laughing matter. We still see rape, abuse, misogyny, sexual frustration, all kinds of breakups and divorces, all related to intimacy and sexuality. It's not like being sexually free has solved those problems. That's a myth. If it's not solving the problems, what is it doing? Well, I think it's perhaps creating new ones instead of fixing the old ones. Excuse me. Basically, in the past, sexual explorations were seen as taboo or deviant. Everybody knew it was happening, but you weren't supposed to talk about it. It was bad. All of it was bad. Anything besides traditional monogamous missionary was bad, right? That was it. Now you're uncomfortable. But today, one of the differences is today, anyone who doesn't support these movements, the sexual freedom and expressiveness, anyone who doesn't support that is considered ignorant or bigoted or perhaps both. So we went from one extreme to another. Before, we couldn't talk about sex because it was all bad. Now, we can't talk about sex because it's all good. Think about that. Isn't that wild? I think that's crazy. And we live in that moment in our culture. And I also get that churches have very little to say about this because they've been historically uptight and anti-erotic. Not to say the Bible is anti-erotic. In fact, it's quite erotic in places. There are books that many of you have heard of in the Bible that explore intimacy and sexuality. We just don't talk about that in church, even though it is a real part of everyday life for most people, or for all people in some way. We don't talk about it. We don't read those scriptures. The church has become anti-erotic. We are anti-sex. Or, more recently, we're very pro-sex in a way that's kind of flippant, and I'll talk about that. But keep in mind, the reason churches have often tried not to talk about this is because we get we get frustrated with the culture. We're often the only voice, and in this culture right now, we are probably the last voice that is calling for sexual responsibility in the world. That's a tough thing to ask for, to tell a bunch of sexually free people that they need to be more responsible. That's a tough thing. And we could also say no other group has figured it out. It's not like the church is doing sex really bad and everybody else figured it out. Nobody's doing sex right. Nobody's got it figured out. Sexuality is complicated. I've never said the word sex this many times in my life. So it's just one of those topics it's easier not to talk about it, or to talk about it in cheesy ways, like a marriage seminar where we just tell you how to care for your spouse's needs better. And, he has physical needs, she has emotional needs. Make sure you tap into those. That's wonderful. Les and Leslie Parrott do a great job of that. They have books and DVDs. We might be doing one of their Bible studies soon on Wednesdays. You have plenty of materials out there to help with your bedroom intimacy, right? But that's not what we need. We need to understand why sexuality has become so taboo. Why is it a weird thing? Why are you cringing while I'm talking about it? That's what I want to know. If you feel alone, I want you to hear this. If you feel alone in your struggles with intimacy or sexuality, your desires, your wants, the things you dream of or fantasize about, the things you want to talk about but you feel like you're not allowed to talk about, I want you to hear this. You're not alone. You're not alone. You're like most humans. It's just we haven't created a safe space to admit that. Because to talk about sex requires a safe space. Because when you talk about sex, you inevitably bring up other concerns like lust, desire, attraction, beauty, aging, body shame, physical health, hormones, libido levels, pregnancy, infertility, mental health, trust issues, psychology related to your mother or your father, addiction, rape, and for some, identity itself. And all of those topics bring up associated feelings of pain, betrayal, guilt, confusion, isolation. Sex is complicated. It's complicated. So let's just quit talking about it. That would be a lot easier, wouldn't it? Let's just keep telling you to be good and go to heaven when you die. But that's not really Christianity, is it? That's not discipleship. One thing that makes it harder to talk about is that for a long time, Christian voices tried to say that sex was just something that you do or don't do and that you should keep it under control. Sexuality, as opposed to sex, the act, sexuality, and I use the words interchangeably because I know they are interchangeable, but the church hasn't always admitted that. We talked about sex and we never talked about sexuality. We just talked about the act of sex, which was reserved for a man and a woman in the marital union to bear children, and that's it, right? Or maybe for pleasure if you're a more liberal preacher, but that's it, right? You can enjoy your spouse and that's it. And that's sex. It's just this thing you do with a married partner. But we never talk about sexuality, and that's a shame. And it leads to shame because you associate sexuality with something taboo. And sexual desire becomes a thing you can't really express unless you're married, and then it's supposed to be a private matter, so you don't talk about it with anybody. It's such a bizarre thing that we've done. And the world is right to accuse the church when they say that we turn sex into this thing that you can just do or not do, instead of admitting sexuality is at the core of a person. It is, isn't it? Just like money isn't just paper in a bank account somewhere with people's faces on it. We admitted that last week, didn't we? That money is more complicated than that. It's at the core of who you are, what you want, what you desire, what you work for, and what you spend it on, what you think it will do for you. There's so much more behind our money, and there's so much more behind sex, if we would talk about it, if we would admit it. So the church said less, and now they're trying to say more, but they're not really saying anything. Christians are backpedaling. You could Google any number of sermons. I tried this week to Google sermons on sexuality, and don't. It's a waste of your time. I mean, unless you find this one on YouTube next week. This one will be good. It was basically pastors talking about, it was either marriage seminars, which I knew that was out there, or it was pastors talking about how great sex is and how fun it is and how smoking hot their wife is. It was just like cheesy, flippant, I don't even know what to call it. 50 years ago, churches were standing against sexuality and sex and saying basically there's a revolution in the 60s and 70s, this love revolution, and now all these STDs spreading everywhere and young people don't know what they're doing and they're getting pregnant as teenagers and they're spreading diseases that they don't want, no one wants. What do we do about this? And so the church has stepped up and said, we have to stop this. And they were fighting for modesty, and they were fighting for responsibility. And over time, that transformed because the culture has so embraced sexuality, or pretended to. I'm going to admit that I don't think the culture knows how to talk about it either. But they've so embraced it that the church is now backpedaling, saying, we kind of meant what we said, but we also love sex, and sex is good. And so now you have a bunch of preachers and Bible teachers trying to say sex is a good thing and we should be open to it. But they're still talking about it like it's just a thing. That's not really any better to say, well, Christians aren't prudes. We have sex too, you know. What does that solve? No one's actually talking about sexuality, not in complex, difficult ways, not in the ways that we actually experience in our day-to-day lives. You pretty much have to go to a licensed therapist to get that kind of help because you can't find it among your peers. No one's doing it. No one's talking. I think there is a place for therapists. I'm just saying I think we should also be able to talk about it as peers, as fellow Christians. We know, listen to me, we know that no one has a perfect sex life, but people want intimacy. We know that no one feels totally comfortable expressing their sexuality, but everyone has sexuality to express. We know that no one has an incredible intimate life in every part of their relationships, and yet we all crave love and affection and intimacy. We know all of that, what we want and what none of us actually have. So to talk about sex in a flippant or dishonest way is just as nearsighted as talking about sex in a shame-fueled way or not talking about it at all. Sexuality is complicated. We need a safe space to think critically about intimacy and sex and who we are and what we want out of life. That's where churches should step in, but we have to tread carefully. So if you let me, I'm going to share a little bit of my childhood experience. So I grew up in what would be called the purity culture. Anybody else know what I'm talking about? Raise them up high. Come on, all you millennials with me and maybe a little bit older. Okay, basically 80s and 90s kids especially, we would know about this. The purity culture involved things like promise rings, which was like your vow to God that you're married to God until you're married to a human. And it was like a sign of your imminent virginity until marriage. And then True Love Waits was one of the programs. The silver ring thing was one of the programs. I don't know if they used any of that here at this church years ago. Some of you grew up here, you might know. There were celebrity endorsements, if you remember that. Singers, actors, athletes, big-time celebrities who would endorse this waiting until marriage. That's what Christians ought to do. They would go to youth groups and speak on it, and they pass around a rose. And then at the end, after all the kids had held the rose, it was crumpled up and falling apart, and they'd say, that's you, if you let people pass you around and use you for sex, which is a great way to get rid of shame. So what a dark and morbid thing to do to teenagers. It's weird. They did that. I watched them do that. There was that book, Why I Kissed Dating Goodbye, by Joshua Harris. And everybody loved that book. He's an atheist now, by the way. And he's divorced. Every Man's Battle and Wild at Heart. Anybody read those books for men? Because we all need to remember that we're all instinctively just animals with carnal cravings and no self-control. That's what every man is, basically. I'm being sarcastic again. But that's what those books said, is that you're basically just a carnal animal who doesn't know how to control yourself. You're always on the brink of totally losing it. Really setting the bar high there for young men of God. I remember church kids, if you can't tell, I'm a little ticked off about it, okay? This messed with me and my marriage, so I'm passionate about this because it in some ways ruined my life, and in other ways has hurt my wife and her experience because of me and because of what she dealt with, and all the people I counsel all the time as a pastor. This is serious, and nobody's talking about it. The only people who talk about it are people who already quit the church and gave up on religion. But Christians need to talk about it. The people who still love Jesus and yet know this wasn't good. All right, so anyway, I remember church kids, literally kids that went to church who would do anything possible sexual with each other except penis and vagina sex. And they were still technically virgins. And they were proud of that because somehow a youth pastor convinced them that was, I guess, credible. I don't know. Absolutely bizarre. Bizarre. Virginity doesn't define purity, by the way. Some of you need to hear that. Virginity does not define purity. Not having sex doesn't mean you're pure. And having sex doesn't mean you can never be pure. That your purity's gone forever. Essentially, here's what we were told as young people in the church. Sex is bad and gross and naughty and inappropriate and dangerous, So wait until you're married and enjoy all that with your spouse. I felt very proud of that. Even when I read it in my office earlier, I thought, that's good. That's going to kill. That will kill. That's going to be almost as good as walking up to Marvin Gaye. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's be serious for a minute again. I try to put a little hints of humor in here because this is a heavy topic. Most of the pressure, in my experience, was placed on young women. So I had it easy. I'm an animal. Just keep me caged. I'll be fine. But these young women, oh my goodness, they're the gatekeepers of purity. They have to be modest. They have to learn to stop these ravenous men from being the wild animals they naturally are. How they dress, these women, that proves whether or not they're really Christian. What they wear, especially what they wear to Sunday service. And if they're asking for it, what do they expect? You don't go up to a dog and rip the food out of its mouth. These men are animals. So talk about victim shaming and rape culture. If a young woman's asking for it, we were taught to think like that. That's pretty screwed up. Women, they are responsible because they have to prevent men from lusting uncontrollably, which sounds like a compliment to women, that they would be capable to control the men, but it's really just unfair pressure upon women. And so those young women grow up to be adult women with lots of guilt and shame associated with everything sexual, and then they do finally marry, many of them, and their husbands don't know how to comprehend this guilt and shame that their wives are experiencing. They don't realize that it was all born and bred into them, environmentally at times. Sadly, through churches most of the time. It's just a bizarre thing. A lot of women feel guilty about anything sexual in their lives. And some men do too. I'll give you an example of how this happened in church. So we were taught the traditional Bible story of David and Bathsheba. Unlike the rabbinical teaching from ancient Judaism that explains that David was a fallen man who took advantage of a woman, a married woman, had his way with her in his palace, and then tried to cover it up and have her husband killed, and then finally got caught in the act. Rather than that story of a man who failed to control himself, it became a story of a temptress named Bathsheba who would bathe on her rooftop to seduce a king when she knew that he was watching. It literally says she was cleaning her blood from menstruating in her rooftop bath, which, by the way, is just where the bath was located. You are not supposed to read that story and picture a temptress seducing a king. You're picturing a woman who just finished her time of the month and she's trying to get clean. But we can do that, can't we? We could take a story about a woman who is truly a victim of sexual assault. Nobody wants to hear that, but David isn't just a murderer. He's a rapist to some extent. Now, maybe she was okay with it. We can't say. But even if it's consensual, is it ever really consensual if you're the king and you grab this woman with an armed guard and have her brought to your palace? Does she have a whole lot of say in the matter, even if she's okay with it? It's just, he didn't give her a choice. It doesn't matter. Nobody ever talked about the story that way. It was just assumed this woman did some evil thing and seduced a good and godly man like King David. And it's easy to preach it that way when it's always men preaching it for hundreds of years. And if a woman questioned it, I tell her she's merely a woman, shut up. Unless you have a penis, you're not allowed to talk in church. Don't you know that? It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. This is the stuff that makes my friends become atheists, if you wonder why I'm so upset about it. I have friends who don't go to church at all because they grew up with all this crap and people who basically said, that's Jesus for you. This is not Jesus. This is idiocy, is what it is. If men were ever held accountable, it was basically bounce your eyes, which is a way of saying you'll never be able to look at a woman and not lust after her. So just bounce your eyes. Don't look at women. Don't be alone in a car or an elevator or an office alone with a woman. Don't put yourself in that temptation. Treat women like they're all temptresses, like Bathsheba. And they have to be avoided. That's not only belittling to men, as if we have absolutely no self-control, which I hope you understand some of us do, or we try to, but it's dehumanizing to women. That is dehumanizing to women. And it doesn't solve the problem of lust. Teaching men to just not how do I want to say this? It's laughable to me. It's so stupid that if I just don't look at women, then I no longer have a lust problem. What? If I just never go through Dunkin' Donuts drive-thru, then I don't like donuts anymore. I just made that up, but that's a pretty good analogy. It's so stupid. That's so stupid. And we convince people that this is real. What we should have done is teach men to value women as sisters in Christ, or even mothers in Christ, or daughters in Christ. Teach men to value women and vice versa. And then maybe we would conquer lust and those carnal instincts. But of course, men had no chance of doing that anyway. They're all doomed to fail. We're just a bunch of animals. John MacArthur clarifies that. He recently preached that all young single adults are just lust bombs ready to explode. What? This guy's a mega church preacher. Some of you love his stuff, John MacArthur. Some of you know exactly who I'm talking about. I don't agree with a lot of his theology to begin with, but then he says stuff like that. I say stupid stuff too. So you can find me on YouTube saying stupid stuff. I get it. But this was one that he said he can get me next week in his sermon. I'm sure he watches me on YouTube. But he said young single adults are just lust bombs ready to explode everywhere. How dumb is that? I mean, how dumb is that? People really believe that if you just wait and get married, then lust will go away like magic. You know what that actually does? It turns your spouse into a sexual outlet instead of a partner in life. That's what it really does. It's selfish. It's the opposite of Christian ethics. And I can tell you from experience, it makes marriage really hard. Really hard. And the Bible disagrees with that premise. MacArthur might say young adults who are single are lust bombs, but Paul said there are some young adults who are meant to be single and gifted by God to live that lifestyle to better serve his kingdom. And I don't think Paul said because they're all secretly lust bombs. He was saying that some people are born with the self-control or given as a gift of God, the self-control to serve God faithfully even in singleness without ever having sex with anybody, because that's not the whole point of life, is to have sex. He says, in fact, that the ones who do have a lot of, like real high libido and sexual energy or whatever you want to call it, that they should consider marriage, but not so they can explode their lust bomb on somebody at last, but so that it's just such a dumb picture. I absolutely hate that. But Paul says you get married not to explode your lust bomb everywhere, but to learn how to give your body away to a partner. He basically says the opposite of John MacArthur. He says marriage isn't there to explode lust bombs, it's to diffuse them. It's not to explode them, it's to diffuse them. It's to fix it. You have all this lust and pent-up desire. Marriage will teach you how to selflessly love another person as you love your own flesh, to care for them, and they in turn care for you. So a husband now belongs to the wife, and the wife belongs to the husband, and you own one another. That's what Paul says. And it is both parties owning one another. He basically says that's the only place where sexuality is allowed to flourish, is in a position of selfless love, or a relationship of selfless love, self-giving love. Anything less than sacrificial love will distort intimacy of any kind. I'll say that again. Anything less than sacrificial love, Christian love, anything less than that will always distort your intimacy. Always. If you think you can have intimacy with another person and not have selfless love for that person, you will not succeed. I know because I often fail. Even erotic love has to be selfless. So the purity movement that I grew up with basically taught young people that if they would wait to have sex until marriage, then they would be blessed. They'd have true love, great sex, happiness, beautiful children, and fulfillment in every relationship. In that model, marriage became a commodity that you need to acquire. It was a proof of faithfulness. And virginity became a status symbol. You wore the ring and made sure everybody knew, I've made a promise to God. I'm the eminent virgin. I'm like Mary. I'm blessed of God. And then in that situation, singleness is sort of a non-option. All of that, so toxic. So we were being taught rules and rewards as opposed to loving relationships. Follow the rules, you will be rewarded. They didn't teach us how complicated marriage really is. They just made sure we didn't have sex until we got married. So then we get married and we have sex and we're like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. Or maybe it was perfect for you. That's also sarcasm. But you didn't want to laugh because your spouses are sitting next to you. Mine's on the other side of the building. Or maybe you grow up and you're eminently single. And you think, I waited and waited for marriage and I'm still not married. What was I supposed to do? Of course, some people break the rules. And in that system of rules and rewards, when you break the rules, you know the reward is ripped away. Your badge of honor is torn off of your chest. And then you realize you could just do whatever you want because you already lost the game. It's over, so just have a good time. And some of my friends did that. You can't go back and restore your virginity. And then some, in order to protect their badge of honor and make sure nobody knew to rip it off, they would do everything in secret. And so many of them developed pornography addictions because that was, better than touching a real person. Porn became an outlet. Even worse, some of these people actually did follow all the rules. They really did follow the rules. And now they're in unhappy marriages or already divorced, or they're still trying to have kids, or they had kids they weren't ready for and they're struggling to raise them, or whatever else, just the struggles of adult life. And now they're angry with God, and they have questions for the church. They are deservedly frustrated because they were told one thing and they experienced something else. A lot of the leaders of that movement are no longer Christians at all. Many of them are divorced. Many of them openly teach against the things that they used to write about and promote because now they see how broken it all was. And it's because of the toxic things churches would say about sex, or I think too often, all the things they wouldn't say about sex. Talking about safe sex, for example, is the work of the devil. You know that. You're not allowed to show kids condoms. You can't talk about sexual responsibility with young people. You're basically telling them, go ahead and have sex. Again, I'm being sarcastic. But some of you probably do feel that way because you were raised to think that way. And it doesn't work. Young people still have sex, and then they get STDs and get pregnant because nobody taught them how to be responsible and how to explore sexuality in healthy ways. I'm not promoting young people having unprotected sex or protected sex. I'm promoting talking about sex, which may have prevented those things from ever happening. And I'm blessed to have had a family that things were not off limits, that we could sit at the dinner table and talk about stuff. And when I had questions after school, my mom would sit us down and we'd talk. My dad would often just chuckle in the corner, but my mom was good at talking about things. And my dad certainly wasn't embarrassed by it. But that's not the case for a lot of my friends, for many of you that I've talked to. Growing up for you, you never talked about sexuality at home or at school or anywhere. Maybe at church, but then it was full of guilt and shame. You only talk about sex to make you feel guilty for it, and you better not do it or else. But that was pretty much all you ever heard about sex. Isn't that sad? So then who did you talk to? Because you were curious, right? You talked to your peers. You talked to other young people, other kids who know absolutely nothing more than you know, right? People who are just as ignorant as you. And I couldn't begin to tell you the stupid things that kids told me when I was growing up about sex. And then you grow up and realize how dumb all of that is. But who else were you going to hear it from? Adults weren't willing to talk about it. Like I said, I'm grateful that my parents had open communication in my childhood home, but many of my friends didn't, and many of you didn't, and some of you in this room who are parents and grandparents still wouldn't be able to talk to your own children and grandchildren about intimacy and about sexuality. Who are they going to talk to? Who do you think they're going to talk to? I'll tell you this, they could pull their phone out and in milliseconds look at pornography of any kind that they want, any category you can imagine. They could go on an AI app and make their own pornography that they want to make. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you don't talk to them, if you don't have these conversations, someone else will fill the gap. And it won't be healthy, and it won't be out of concern for their well-being. It'll probably be to make money off of them and turn them into addicts. Even now, a culture that is so hypersexual doesn't know how to talk about sex. Sex sells. We see half-naked people everywhere. Most movies are softcore pornography now. And still, nobody knows how to actually talk about sexuality or intimacy. It's crazy. So then people end up feeling isolated or being ignorant. And those things lead to depression and addictive patterns. And that's where pornography and adultery and abuse seem to come from. So I wonder if we could backtrack to the beginning where we never talk about it in honest and open ways, if maybe some of those later results would be diminished. Maybe there'd be less porn addiction, less spousal abuse, less rape, less sexual violence of any kind, less adultery and cheating, if in the beginning, as we're growing up, we could actually talk about it as Christians with God's loving ethic and an openness and honesty. Because you can't find that anywhere else. And the older you get, I've been saying a lot about young people, but the older you get, the more awkward it is to talk about these things because you're an adult now and you should have figured it out. I can't tell you how many people I've counseled who have been married for decades who still struggle with sexuality and intimacy. You don't just figure it out. Who can you talk to if you can't talk to your fellow Christians? And then we have the issues like homosexuality or transgenderism or hypersexuality and addiction. And these are all byproducts of being human. They're not diseases, and we need to be careful how we talk about things. You don't treat people for these things. They're real-life categories for people in a broken and fallen world who are exploring who they are as people, which involves their sexuality. The church has to be a safe space for all people. When I say a safe space, I don't mean that we condone all the things that all people do. That's idiotic. But I do mean that we can't be closed-minded bigots who don't talk about reality. You can't be either one. The world does that. That's what the world does. They support every agenda and every person because they don't know how to talk about the issues. Nobody's actually talking about it. Do you see the problem? There is no safe, healthy space to explore all of these things. There has to be, and it needs to be, the church. You can't pretend it doesn't matter, that sexuality isn't important and everyone should just do whatever they want. And you can't pretend that sexuality isn't real and not talk about it. We need a place where all of God's children can explore intimacy, sexuality, meaning, and relationships, where they can find Jesus in the midst of all of that and walk in his path. That journey will inevitably involve conversations surrounding sex. And I don't think we have those conversations from the pulpit to the congregation. Those are conversations you have to have privately as Christians. You have to learn how to have them with your brothers and sisters in Christ. And to do that, we have to get rid of the stigma. That's why I've said the word sex so many times today, so you could hear that it's not dirty. If your pastor says sex and sexuality 100,000 times on a Sunday morning, then maybe this week when you think about sex, you won't feel so triggered. When your kids ask you questions, you won't feel as awkward. I don't know. Maybe you'll feel even more awkward. I might have ruined it by talking so much about it. I don't know. I can't go back in time now. All right, so I brought a prop. Okay, I got some kindling, some dry sticks from out in the yard out there, and a lighter. And then the person in the hallway, would you bring the gas can in for me? We're gonna set a fire here as an illustration, and I thought for sure. Oh yeah, you can trust me. I thought for sure somebody would get up and leave at this point. You're not concerned at all. I'm gonna light a fire in the middle of this room. There's no sprinkler system in here. Nope, no care. Okay, all right. Why wouldn't I light a fire right here on the stage? This is gonna be such a simple illustration for you to hold on to, I hope. Why would I not light that fire right here? Because fire is bad. Fire is evil. Fire is the devil. So you should never light fires, right? No, I think I heard someone say because it's not safe, which is a pretty good answer. Yeah, I mean, it seems perfectly safe to me. I could scoot away from it. Yeah, we don't light fires just anywhere because that would be idiotic, wouldn't it? Okay, so what if fire, let's keep this short. What if fire is an illustration for sexuality and intimacy, for passion? Passion is a good thing. Fire is a good thing when it has parameters, when there are safeguards in place to use it rightly. I can think of no better illustration for what we're talking about than to think about fire, because fire does so much good. Fire is I mean, if you've watched Survivor, you know, whichever tribe doesn't get fire right away, they really struggle. I mean, you need fire. You know what it's like right now in the wintertime if your heat were to go out. If you didn't have some kind of fuel to heat your home, you'd freeze. Fire is helpful. It's also how we cook. Fire, in some ways, makes life tremendously better. And yet fire could also burn you or kill you. It could burn down buildings. It could set forests ablaze. Fire is a pretty good analogy for sexuality. If you build your fire in the right place, you could let it burn hot. It'll do good. But too often we either light fires in dangerous places or we snuff out every fire because they could be dangerous. And I think that's what churches do. They just snuff out all the fire because it's too dangerous. And the world lights every fire everywhere and says, let the fires burn. Fire's good. And we see all kinds of lives being burned down. What Christians ought to do is light fires responsibly with parameters in place so that people can enjoy the benefits of the fire without suffering. And I have to say this. Some of you in this room are building fires in the wrong places. You're texting the wrong person. You are watching the wrong videos. You're reading the wrong Reddit thread. You are laying in the wrong bed at night. You're building a good and beautiful fire, but in the wrong place. And I don't want you to get burned. And I don't want you to burn someone else. Because I know what that's like. I have a propane grill at home. And for one of my kids' birthdays a few years ago, I had it under the patio. And the soffit was probably 6 feet above head. I mean, it was pretty high up there. I never would have thought. But there was a grease fire. I had too many burger patties on the grill. It was a 6-burner, and I was overzealous. Anyway, had a grease fire, and by the time I got out there with a little fire extinguisher from our kitchen and put it out, not only did I ruin all those burgers, which was really sad, especially for all the hungry little children who were happy behind me and suddenly crying. So don't worry, we'll get Little Caesars. It'll be fine. By the time I got back, and it's still there, I've never replaced the soffit. I like to keep things like this to remind me how dumb I am. It had melted the soffit to the point that the plastic was dripping, like it was about to drip off of the soffit. The plastic itself had melted that much, just from this little grease fire in my grill. Because I built a fire to cook burgers, which is a great thing. The kids would have loved the burgers. But by the end of it, no one got a burger, and my soffit got melted because I put the fire in an unsafe place. Okay, that's a good story. But it's not my only one. So I'm really good as a grill master. So same grill, different location. So now I have it out from under a patio, out in the open air behind the house, and the igniter is broken. It sat all winter. I cleaned it up for the spring, and the igniter had gotten wet and frozen and all that, and just the connection was bad, and so the igniter wouldn't light. It wouldn't snap, There was no spark. So I had the propane turned on. I tried to ignite it. Nothing happened. I turned the propane up on the knobs, tried to ignite it. Nothing happened. I realized the igniter must be bad. I go in, get a AAA battery, put it in. The igniter still doesn't spark. It's one of those battery igniters built into the grill. It still doesn't spark. So I go in and I look for a lighter. I pour myself a nice cold lemonade. I come back outside. Finally, I light it up, and then I have to see if I still have eyebrows. I thought I was quick, but I was not quick enough. So now I've lit the fire in the right place, but I did it out of order. I shouldn't have allowed that much gas to build up, right? Propane is flammable. I don't know if you knew that. So I know what it's like to get burned when you build a fire in the wrong place. I know what it's like to get burned when you build your fire in the wrong order. And I wish I were just talking about using my grill. What do we do with all this? At least today, in a big group setting when time's winding down, what can we say about this process? We need to acknowledge that, like most things in life, sexuality is rooted in theology. What you believe about God should inform what you think about everything else in your life. God made the world. He made people. He made intimacy. God created intimacy and sexuality within people. God did that. You're not a sexual being because of the devil, right? That is somehow a gift from God. So then we need to explore what that means in the right context. What is a person? What is intimacy? What is love? And to do this, Jesus tells us we have to fit our story into the greater story. In Matthew's gospel, chapter 19, the Pharisees tried to test Jesus. They asked him a question. They said, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And he said, didn't you read that God created them from the beginning and made them male and female? And he said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but they are one flesh. Therefore God has joined this together. Man cannot separate it. So Jesus, instead of answering their question, tells them the story. And it's a story of the order and purpose in God's creation. Pay attention to the story Jesus tells. For Jesus, sexuality and intimacy are rooted in the story of God and humankind, a story of structure, order, peace, intentionality, and ultimately love, selfless love. I don't have easy answers today to talk about sex, but I do have a story that roots all sexual expression and intimacy in a state of deep covenantal, sacrificial, enduring, eternal love. Sexuality that cannot exist in that sort of love, coexist with that sort of love, or any kind of intimacy that doesn't fit within God's story is missing the mark. And hamartia, to miss the mark, is literally the word for sin. So that's what sin is. It's when we miss the mark. And the way we use sex today as something instead of sexuality as part of who we are, the way we try to force intimacy without sacrificial love, these things are missing the mark. They're missing the mark. It's sin. And we shouldn't be surprised that a God who created intimacy between creatures would design that intimacy to be experienced within the parameters of covenantal, faithful, selfless love, because that's who God is. That's the story in which sexuality has to be discovered. So I want to read a few scriptures as we close. Genesis 2:24. This is the one we just heard. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two become one flesh. It's mutual ownership. They share together all things. Then Paul quotes that, and in Ephesians 5, he says, this is a profound mystery, how two people become one flesh. But I'm telling you, it's Christ and his church. That's what God is talking about. You think it's just about husbands and wives, but it's actually about Christ and his church. Where did Paul learn that? Well, you go back to Isaiah 62, verse 5. As a young man marries a young woman, so will your maker marry you. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will your God rejoice over you. So Paul studies the Hebrew scriptures and finds out marriage is just a foretaste, a little glimpse into divine love, into the love God will have for us, a kind of intimacy that is beyond the erotic. It's better than eroticism. It's better than just sex. It is a deeper and more fulfilling kind of intimacy that we can't even imagine. And it's hard for us to even talk about because we've made such a shameful state out of sexuality. And then here's one we don't often read in church. You're going to love this one. Ezekiel 16, verses 7 and 8. God speaking to Israel, his beloved. You grew, you developed, you entered puberty. Your breasts had formed, your hair had grown, but you were stark naked. Later I passed by, and when I looked at you, I saw that you were old enough for love, so I spread the corner of my garment over you, and I covered your naked body. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. Ooh, saucy. That's in the Bible. How many of you have read that before? Show me your hands. Okay, some of you did like a read the whole Bible in a year plan. And you're like, I'm sure I read that because I did the whole thing. How many of you remember that? Anybody remember that passage? Probably not. Whatever we do with sex, it has to fit that story. It has to. It has always been about God and God's people. God isn't afraid to talk about sex and intimacy because it's not dirty. It's beautiful, but only within the parameters of love, selfless, covenantal love, the way God designed it. So whatever we might say about sex, we can at least say this much is true. It is an expression of selfless, enduring love, of God's own love. If sex is anything less than that, we miss the mark. And I think we could do better. It requires living in this new narrative, the story that Jesus tells, God's story. All right, this is a long quote. I want you to be prepared. Underneath the pop and fizzle of sexological enthusiasm lies a fundamental despair. Not about life itself, but about the body. It seems counterintuitive. Surely the sexual revolution, which is all about the celebration of the body over and against the pretense that love ends below the neck, yet beneath all that pageantry of free sex and self-love, there's this fundamental belief that the body doesn't mean anything. It's insignificant. In a literal sense, it signifies nothing. Your body means nothing. You could do anything you like with your body. You could pleasure it with a vacuum cleaner. You could get a drunken stranger in an alleyway to whip it. You could give it to anyone for any reason. It's just a wet machine, a tool that you use in exchange for whatever purpose suits your fancy. The world is trying to understand humanity without God. And one of the most obvious places we see that is sexuality. You can't detach sex and intimacy from God. Sexuality and intimacy will never make sense in a world devoid of God. Luckily, that world doesn't exist. There is no world devoid of God or his love. Like everything else in the created universe, sexuality must be viewed through the lens of God's perfect love. And perhaps the best news we learn from Scripture is that you don't need to be sexual in order to experience intimacy and love. Sex becomes a byproduct or an experience within a loving relationship, but it's not necessary for a loving relationship. And that's really good news. That's why we see people like Naomi and Ruth, or David and Jonathan, or Elijah and Elisha, or even Jesus with his disciples and the women who followed him. And we assume none of those groups or individuals had a sexual relationship with each other, and yet they had deep, intimate love for one another, the kind of love that can get you through life and keep joy in your life. Sexuality is just woven into our being and our relationships that should be relationships of love. You love God, you love others, and you even love yourself. And I think Jesus said something about that. He might have said that was the most important command of all, to love God and to love your neighbors as yourself. All sexuality, all intimacy is rooted in love. It has to be. That's what the gospel says. The gospel informs everything in our lives, including our sexuality. If God's love is not somehow incorporated into your sexual life, your intimate life, then you're doing something wrong. And if you can't incorporate it because it feels dirty or shameful, you have been misinformed. Sex is not something to be ashamed of. Sexuality is not something to be ashamed of. Intimacy is not something to be ashamed of. God wants to be involved in that aspect of your life, just like every other part of your life. I'm just not sure we know how to do that at this moment. How do we bring God back into a conversation that we've kicked God out of? I don't know, but we have to work on that together. I'm still unlearning a lot of the things I was taught for many years, things that made sex shameful. And I'm trying not to go to the other extreme and letting my curiosities run rampant and say everything's okay, because that's just as foolish. But I think there is a moderate, healthy view somewhere in the middle. And as I invite God back into the realm of my own sexuality, my own intimate life, I find that shame disappears. The parameters become clear. Then my passion can be contained safely. I can enjoy the warmth of the fire that God gifted me, and I'm not worried I'm going to burn myself and other people in the process. As fellow Christians, I think that's where we could begin to help each other, because sex is complicated, sexuality is complicated, but selfless love is profoundly simple. So let's start there. Let all the things we do, including sexuality, grow out of selfless love.